friend, welcome. Today we're going to share some interesting stories of the abandoned hospitals that you won't believe across the world. Please watch it until the end and it will really surprise you. So let's begin. First, Ellis Island Immigrant Hospital. In the early 1900s, those who landed on Ellis Island were checked out before entering New York, and those who needed medical attention were ordered to stay at the Ellis Island Immigrant Hospital. Smithsonian.com notes about 10% of all those who arrive on the island, that's about 1.2 million people, were admitted. They treated everything from measles to scarlet fever. Unfortunately, by the 30s, the hospital, along with the island itself, was in decline. They shut their doors due to immigration policies tightening and having fewer patients come through. And 29 hospital buildings were totally abandoned. Efforts to restore the hospital buildings and other structures on the island are being made by the Save Ellis Island Foundation. The hospital complex has been open to the public on a limited basis for a hard hat tour since 2014. Next, Graveyard Asylum for the Chronic Insane. In the late 1800s, a New York surgeon proposed the idea of creating a state-run hospital for the mentally ill, who were too sick to take care of themselves. The hope is that this place could provide rehabilitation. Unfortunately, most of the patients never left. Instead, it was found that many were subject to abuse while under the asylum's care. It was abandoned because of the horrible conditions, and when the patients would die, they were just reportedly buried in graves across the street. In 1995, an employee from the hospital found nearly 400 suitcases from the patients with their belongings still left inside. Friends, before we go on, like this video, smash the subscribe button and click the notification bell right now. Let's move on. Pripyat Hospital. The 1986 Chernobyl accident stands as one of the worst nuclear explosions in history. On the night of the accident at the nearby Chernobyl nuclear power plant, the firemen and workers at the plant were brought to the hospital suffering from radiation, sickness, and burns. The firemen were taken to the hospital by ambulance, still wearing their suits. After 30 years, their suits stored in the basement of the hospital. Still emit a little dose of radiation, sleeping into the hospital was a sobering experience. Once a busy maternity hospital, the end building now stands empty. The operating theater is silent, and the cribs in the nursery empty. And while today you can enter the Ukrainian city as a tourist and view all that was left behind. By the hundreds of thousands of citizens evacuated, it comes with strict conditions, and you must obey. The hospital has since been abandoned due to radiation. Linda Vista Hospital. In 1904, Linda Vista Hospital was built by the Santa Fe Railroad Company, specifically to take care of its employees who became injured on the job. But as the necessity for the railroad lessened over time, the hospital started to take in others who needed care from around the troubled neighborhood. Those who were victims of gang-related crimes and drug overdose became the hospital new regulars. Sadly, after budget cuts and a thin staff, the hospital was closed and abandoned in 1991. It's since been turned into apartments, though many claim it's haunted. Next, IFRA Advanced Dressing Station. Not all hospitals were built to last, and such was the case of this dressing station from World War I outside IFRA, Belgium. Mental Floss notes these concrete rooms were where casualties sought medical attention immediately after first being injured. It was also the first area that Germans attacked using toxic gas during warfare. Canadian Lieutenant Colonel John McRae was one of the doctors who worked here. He also watched his friend Alexis Helmer, but died, and he subsequently wrote the family's point in Flanders Field, why it was abandoned, makeshift, and temporary war hospital. Next, Hudson River State Hospital. This New York State Psychiatric Hospital had all the right intentions, and it actually lasted quite a long time. At last, obscure reports the Hudson River State Hospital began operating in 1871, all the way up until 2003. It first accepted only 40 patients with the idea of creating ideal sanctuaries for the mentally ill. The duo who created Central Park also helped construct the facilities. Despite the promise of new treatment methods and the beautiful facilities, the large town populations and lack of funding caused the hospital to shut down and became abandoned. Next, Penhurst State School and Hospital. You can visit Penhurst during Halloween for a fun haunted attraction, and you also may take away a bit of history with you. Originally, this 1,400-acre site was created to keep the mentally ill away from mainstream society, and while it was initially designed to hold up to 500 patients, it suffered from overcrowding very quickly. There was a point in 1946 when just 7 physicians were tending to over 2,000 patients in 1987. The institution was officially shut down after the bad conditions from overcrowding were exposed. The building were abandoned too, with all of the items from patients and hospital work still left out. Next, Waverly Sanatorium. The early 1900s were a dangerous time for tuberculosis. The Waverly Hills Sanatorium in Kentucky was opened in 1926 to keep those sick with tuberculosis away from the general public. It serviced over 400 patients, and at the time it was also considered to be one of the most well-equipped facilities. Unfortunately, for some, once you went to Waverly Hills, you became a resident for life. When a successful tuberculosis antibiotic was finally found, there was no need to keep the hospital going, and by 1961, everyone had left, and the building suffered from decades of vandalism and damages afterwards. It was abandoned because of the obsolete after a tuberculosis antibiotic was found. Next, Knockton Hall. Thousands of sick and injured soldiers were treated from the start of the World War I up until the First Gulf War in Knockton Hall, England. Today, Daily Mail Online notes Knockton Hall has since been vandalized and subject to arson after its abandonment. But in the 40s, the facilities found here were vital in keeping soldiers alive. It was abandoned in the early 90s, and by the mid-90s, the building was sold to become a residential home. Soon after that, however, it was abandoned once more, thus making it an easy target for vandals, and was abandoned because no longer needed after the war. Next, Medfield Hospital. The Creighton Advertiser reminds us this hospital had seen some famous faces as relatives of David Bowie, Michael Caine, and Charlie Chaplin. All were treated here. Cane Hill Hospital opened in London in 1883, and by 1888, it reached full capacity for its treatment and the mentally ill. A large number of discharged servicemen who needed mental health ended up going here after World War I and World War II. By 1961, the health minister aimed to close asylums around the country. However, leading to the slow decline and abandonment of Cane Hill, then in 2010, what was left of the directly facility was destroyed by a huge fire. It was abandoned because the health minister wanted to close down Asylum. Next, Letchworth Village. Mental Flaws Explained. Letchworth Village was created in New York back in 1911 in an effort to create an appropriate village for those with mental illness. It housed about 4,000 patients, most of whom were children. There was hope that those who attended Letchworth Village would get new progressive treatments to aid them. But decades later, many realized that wasn't the case. In 1996. The hospital was closed due to reports of abuse and neglect that spanned for decades. Today, there are still beds, paintings, and other items left behind by the children and workers who resided there. Next, Charity Hospital. Here's a hospital that was left behind in more recent times at Huffington Post reports. Charity Hospital in New Orleans operated for 300 years and was, at one point, the second oldest and largest free hospital in the history of the U.S. Unfortunately, it was damaged and flooded during the Hurricane Katrina, and while there were efforts to get it running after the storm, state and federal funding decided to put their money elsewhere. Over a decade after Hurricane Katrina and the remains of the hospital are still present, a new hospital has since been built a quarter mile away from this abandoned structure. Next, Southwest Detroit Hospital. This abandoned hospital in Detroit drew the attentions of photographer Robert Johnson, Sleep Talk notes, who brought this facility back into the public eye with these photos. In Bright Sun Film YouTube episodes of Abandoned, they explained that the hospital originally opened indoors in 1973, but it didn't last long as it was shuttered in 1993 after lack of funding and poor quality of care. The property was purchased again, but the facility was horrible despair. The building was completely abandoned in 2007 after the new owners were suspected of fraud. Next, Medfield State Hospital. Unlike many of the other abandoned facilities on the list, you can still go to the Medfield State Hospital in Massachusetts to take a look around. Medfield Patch reports the Asylum for the Mentally Ill opened in 1896 helped relieve the overcrowding of other state facilities. It was the first state mental hospital to be built with smaller, individual buildings to allow for more light and ventilation too. Unfortunately for the hospital, most of the patients moved on to halfway houses by the mid-70s. The state closed the hospital when its number of patients dropped to under 200. Next, Trans-Allegheny Lunatic Asylum. If you've never seen the outside of the Trans-Allegheny Lunatic Asylum in West Virginia, it's well worth a visit. It stands as the largest hand-cut stone masonry building in North America, and it took over 20 years to construct in the late 1800s. To help the chronically insane, it was also designed in a staggered way for optical sunlight and fresh air. In 1864, the hospital was opened to patients, but it soon saw overcrowding. By 1950, there were 2,400 people occupying the space, leaving the poor condition. It was ultimately shut down and abandoned, and the local economy is reportedly still feeling the effects. It was abandoned because change in mental illness treatment and deteriorations of the building. Patients were sleeping on the floor and in freezing room due to lack of furniture and heat. Now, the once ornate building intended for healing but destined for destructions sit abandoned as if the patients simply vanished into thin air. Rooms are still filled with medical equipment and decrepit furniture, and wheelchairs sit in the hallways. The asylum has also become a training ground for experimental lobotomies, as Walter Freeman, the famous surgeon in lobotomy, advocated in 1888. Former and amateur scientist Graham Hemrick, both two female cadavers, Dr. Frankenstein mummified them with his patented embalming potions, just as he had done in earlier experiments with vegetables, snakes, and the head of the man that kept in a jar. His goal is to unlock the secrets of the pharaohs and recreate their unique methods of measurement preservation. This is a story of one West Virginia man's curious mind, how he managed to develop a formula for making mummies, and how he refused to give this secret formula away for years, how his experiments resulted in 2 mummified females from the Trans-Allegheny Lunatic Asylum, and how they have survived for over 120 years. At that time, the process is thought to have taken several weeks, but no one was really sure how long. When Hemrick's process finished and the results were visible, he had created what resembled Egyptian mummies. He began to share his success with others in the local area and beyond. Eventually, he was contacted by the Smithsonian Institute, who wanted to add the mummies to the museum's collection and display them to the public with the formula he invented. The farmer refused to share the formula even though he had sent in the process into U.S. Patent Office. The mummies remained in Barber County until they were recruited by Kenya's state governments for his circus shows. The mummies spent several years touring the United States during the end of the 1800s. Finally, they were returned to Barber County at the Hemrick family. They stored the bodies in several different places over the years in barn of the farm, under the bed of a local history vault. In 1985, the 2 female mummies even survived the worst flood in North Central West Virginia. That's it for now, friends. I hope you like our documentaries about this abandoned hospital, And there's still more to come. Please subscribe and turn on the notification. You can comment below, will be appreciated. Have a great one everyone, and goodbye for now.